We are live on the camera. The folks out in internet land are expecting us to appear at this moment. So I want to welcome you all for the last and culminating lecture from Professor Dr. Peter Heusser. And we have only one more time to enjoy this. So please welcome the professor.
Barry usually knows where I have my weak points. And before he came up here, he said, well, that's going to be your terminating lecture, right? And I probably knew why, because I have to take care that I can really terminate. So, well, dear friends, today I'm going to talk about Rudolf Steiner's contribution to the evolution of science. But I will enlarge the title a little bit. And it says, from natural science to spiritual science, Troxler, Fichte, and Rudolf Steiner's contribution to the evolution of science. The names I will write on the board afterwards. Although materialistic reductionism is still dominating our civilization and prevalent in academic science and education, there can be no doubt that spirituality and a renewed interest in religious questions have become an ever-growing field of human needs and striving. This process has become more and more apparent since the second half of the 19th century. In the United States, for example, in the 19th century through the movement of Spiritism, or through the foundation of the Theosophical Society in New York. I think it was 1875 or 76. And especially since the 1960s, many different forms of spirituality and meditation, from virtually every geographical and historically known cultural tradition, are offered in the fora of what has become a worldwide market of spirituality, often in popularized and sometimes commercialized forms. The characteristic features of this trend are the frequent recourse to earlier, sometimes ancient, often Eastern spiritual traditions. Their predominant use for psychological, psychophysiological health issues, such as relaxation, stress reduction, quality of life, well-being, and others. Their entrance into Western science through their inclusion in psychophysiological research in order to measure their effects. In medicine, for example, this has become a great field of research, especially in the United States. The coexistence of the spiritual concepts and worldviews of spiritual traditions, for example, Ayurveda, yoga, Zen, Buddhism, etc., with a common spiritless, mechanistic understanding of matter, biology, and body-mind interaction of reductionist Western science, but with a tremendous gap between them, with no real conceptual mediation between them. Also, one tends to forget that these ancient spiritual traditions within these old cultures, and sometimes until the present, had to a large extent a spiritual goal. For example, meditation was a means to acquire higher spiritual forms of consciousness, to gain experience of higher spiritual worlds, and were not intended at physical well-being and relaxation. And meditation was not an isolated practice, but one component, an important, but one component of a spiritual path called initiation, based on a more encompassing, gradual transformation of the whole inner personality in connection with a moral catharsis to this higher aim. It is not astonishing, however, that the original spiritual goal and context of spiritual practices is very often left aside. For higher spiritual forms of consciousness, the awareness of spiritual forces or beings in nature and the cosmos are not a common everyday experience in our times. They are also easily taken for mental pathologies, sometimes, if discussed, for example, in more scientific context, and certainly not viewed as a field of modern science. Likewise, the forms of meditation adopted from ancient spiritual cultures do usually not take their point of departure from our rational thinking consciousness, which has been globally developed since the onset of Occidental culture at the time of classical Greece, but of course globally. And since then have become the basis of modern science. But such meditational practices take their departure often from other mental operations, such as sensory, emotional, or also bodily awareness, such as in breathing, body awareness, bodily positions or activities or others, under deliberate omission of rational thinking activity. In consequence, the newly expanding field of spirituality is not considered as a source of science, or more precisely, as being able to provide a way to gain secure, objectifiable knowledge of the spiritual realms in a way comparable to or equivalent with natural science, which gains its knowledge in the material realms of reality. But this does not have to remain so. Indeed, ancient, more spiritual forms of knowing and of experiencing disappeared more and more as the newer forms of knowing, based on sensory perception and rational thinking, developed as a common faculty in humankind and turned globally into the decisive driving factor of everyday life practice and science, within, of course, hundreds of years, but especially within the last 500 or 200 years or so. And so it is understandable that now, when a new longing for spirituality is awaking, one turns to spiritual practices from older cultures, which were or are still living or were living before or independent of the advent of natural science and rational thinking. But, and that's something I would like to talk about tonight, the newer history of science shows that Western science can lead out of itself to a new spiritual ascent, transcending the field of matter and working its way into the realms of the immaterial. And this is important, to do so without recourse to ancient spiritual forms of mental practices, but instead on the basis of its own principle of science, with careful observation and thinking. In what is to come, I would like to briefly sketch two examples of this evolution of science from the 19th century, and then turn to Rudolf Steiner, who has set the principal standards for this development. The first one is Ignaz Paul Vital Troxler. Troxler was born in Switzerland. Here you see a picture of Troxler about 1830, so we have an impression. You see that he is a choleric person. And he sure was. So just I think I can put it off again because it makes noise, right? So you just thank you. He was born in Switzerland near Lucerne, studied medicine and philosophy in Jena, Germany, the neighboring town of Weimar, where at the time Schiller and Goethe lived. He was a student of Schelling and Hegel, a favorite student of Schelling, for example, and also Fichte, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, the father of the Fichte I will talk today, was still in Jena when he came. Then he worked as a physician in his residency training, some years in Vienna, where Beethoven was among his patients. There still exists a letter which ends from a letter of Beethoven to Troxler, which ends with the lines, they make some appointment in the town, and then he says, "Behalten Sie lieb Ihren Freund Troxler." What's in English? Well, it's a very friendly. Yeah. So anyhow, and his later life, he was in Switzerland working as a physician, a pedagogue, politician, and philosopher. He became, at the time when this picture was drawn, in 1830, he became professor of philosophy at the University of Basel, and a few years later in Bern. He tried to further develop Schelling's philosophy of nature. And here comes an important point. Schelling said that the human spirit is able to grasp the lawfulness of nature in the form of ideas in his thinking. We had this in the first evening, right? And in this state, the human being participates spiritually in nature. He uses the word identical because the laws that we think are identical with the laws that work out in nature. We had that on the first lecture. And you see that today this appears again in physics, like Walter Heiter I talked about. So actually this starts to be in the culture again, this kind of thinking. Now, Troxler said, and that's now very interesting, we should not only think the spiritual in nature, this lawfulness, in the form of ideas, we should learn to perceive the spirit in nature. Not only think, but perceive the living spirit in nature. To this idea, he probably came through another element of Schelling's philosophy of nature, and this is the fact and problem of life. Life was a topic, a great topic discussed in these early years of the 18th and 19th century. The cosmos is filled with life, and everywhere on Earth we find life, but we have to assume the existence of life. We cannot perceive life. We have to infer its existence, and because it manifests everywhere. So Troxler wrote a little book called Life and Its Problem in 1806, where he says life is the great unknown X. The unknown X, as in mathematical equations, which we do not know. So he thought about it, well, what about this? And then he came to the idea, well, we should learn to perceive life and to develop what he then called the vital sin, vital sense. Vital sin, that means a sense, faculty of sense, of perception of life, that we should develop, and that we should develop a science which is based on this vital sin, and this he called not biology, but how? No. Biosophy. But biosophy. And he wrote a book, Elemente der Biosophie, Elements of Biosophy, 1808. So you see the direction into which this is going. He then dealt more with not only the issue of life, but the issue of the human being. That he called anthropology. And there he developed the view that actually our human being is a fourfolded being, which has a certain relationship to the realms of nature. Here you go. The four realms of nature. Geist, human spirit. Body, the physical body. Leib, which is related to Leben. Leib is actually an expression for the living body. It means the life in the body. And Seele, the soul. This corresponds to Erdwelt, earthly, material world. The life to the plant world. The soul to the animal world. And the spirit, that's the human world that humanity has for itself. Fourfoldness in Troxler's philosophy. He wrote that book in 1812. It was called, in English, Views on the Human Being. Goethe, who still was very active at that time, read the book in the November of that year and said it is one of the, it is one of the most interesting books of this year, but it irritates people because it's not written well, so it's a bit confusing in a way. And there's a certain truth to it, because Troxler had a rather baroque way of expressing himself, and it's not easy to read language-wise. And therefore, so he was a little bit right, but anyhow, he thought this was a very important book of that year, Goethe. Now, Troxler, even before writing this book, he envisaged a theory of medicine. He wrote a book about theory of medicine in which he made the theoretical attempt, this was just theoretical, philosophical attempt, to differentiate the human organs as according to the predominant working of the physical life, soul, or spirit, right? So you see in what direction that goes. And so health and disease are then not envisaged as a correct or incorrect functioning of purely physical processes, but a harmonious or non-harmonious interaction of the physical body, life, body, soul, and spirit in that context. Rudolf Steiner, later in 1820, when he gave his first medical lecture cycle, at the end of the first of these lectures, he mentioned this concept of Troxler for health and disease. He says this is very important because there one would see like through holes into another world. That means, and that's what it's Rudolf Steiner's expression, but what he meant is that actually when, for example, the soul is working too strongly, this will lead to a certain decay in processes, and so you could detect the way the soul works in the body through disease. So it's like through the disease that you look into another world, in the immaterial realm of the world or the human organization, and the physical body is only what he calls the Vorwerk, like the facade. The facade of the human totality towards the world. So such ideas Troxler had, and in the following years, then he had more philosophical ideas again, and he worked out a theory of knowledge in which he attempted to sketch a new or expanded form of science which corresponds to his anthropology, also this fourfold anthropology, and his general worldview, which arises from that, as we saw, how, you know, this relation to nature, and which of course comprises material and immaterial aspects. Troxler calls, in this context, for a new form of knowledge and of experience of the immaterial, of the spiritual side of reality, but which follows the same principle of cognition as anthropology does, the physical science of the human being. Namely, having two elements, perceptions and concepts. You see? And this science became a name, got the name. This is anthroposophy, anthroposophy. Already in 1828, Troxler talked about this anthroposophy. In fact, this theory of knowledge with the title Natural Theory of Human Cognition was published in 1828. In the following year, 3 volumes of his Logic, and in 1835, his Lectures in Philosophy. In the first of this book, he says, for example, that in the future, anthroposophy will explain that what we will explain the spiritual in the human being in a similar way as natural science explains, or physics explains what we see as colors and what we hear as sounds. He does it in a little bit poetic way. He says the following. Troxler, 1828. Goethe is still living 4 more years.
Give us the page.
Page 242.
Thank you.
But the time will come, and it is not far away, when anthroposophy will explain the natural phenomena of the realm of spirit in the human being to the spirit, just as physics explains the rainbow to our sight and the Aeolian harp to our ear. Right? And already earlier, he wrote in a little medical publication that well, he was in a fight with the government of the canton of Lucerne, and because there was a great epidemic, like the 1918 flu, same thing happened then. Many people died. Troxler did not lose anybody, as he said. And then he says, well, you must think at different things. You must explain diseases differently. Because diseases can also have a spiritual origin. And he says here, quote, "He who is not able to reach and observe such illnesses at their origin with a spiritual view and to follow them from there will certainly not recognize them in the corpse. Even though he rummage around in their entrails and look, smell, taste, feel, and touch, he will at most find the residues of processes which have ceased. A much higher research is therefore required in order to find the cause itself." He means a spiritual kind of cause. "Doctors will actually have to rise far above their previous views on the etiology of such diseases, because they do not only concern physical causes, but also immaterial ones." So, and then you must see, Troxler at that time, this was before the 1940s when materialism started in a very strong sense, so people were still open to such ideas, and because of his logic, he was appointed professor for philosophy at the University of Basel, and then when in 1834 the University of Bern was founded, he was appointed professor of philosophy there, and he had his lectures, and in these lectures of the first semester he had were immediately published afterwards, and you can see, if you don't believe me, that he talked about black or white. That's from the table of contents, anthroposophy, etc. So you see, at the roots of the University of Bern is anthroposophy, and maybe to say something personal, I feel very privileged that in my life I could install the first department of anthroposophic medicine at the university, at this very university. And I think it is interesting that it is at this university where anthroposophy was first taught, that anthroposophic medicine became its home, so to speak. And and Troxler was a famous person at the time for political reasons also. One reason might interest you as Americans, and this is after Switzerland had been rolled over by Napoleon in the shortly before 1800, and after Napoleon was defeated in Germany in 1813, in Switzerland and in all countries, the old conservative forces came to power again, and Troxler was very much against that and fought for popular rights, the people, was in prison for a short time, and then aroused the problem how to reorganize Switzerland as a country in a new way, in such a way that the different cantons would have their own possibilities of development, but nevertheless it would be a whole state, the whole country. And Troxler had the idea we could look to America and could introduce the American system of these double chambers. And he proposed that in 1833. He was not successful, but in 1848, when today's Swiss Constitution was founded, this was the idea which solved the problem. So it was Troxler. Thanks to Troxler, in Switzerland, we also had the same parliamentary system. In other ways, it's different, but this is Troxler. So he was very well known, and for this reason, he also had to make the introductory speech at the opening of the University of Bern. So you see that at this time, it was interesting, and anthroposophy was something interesting. So, I come to Immanuel Hermann Fichte. I will make that a bit shorter. Fichte. Fichte was the son of Johann Gottlieb Fichte. He studied philosophy in Berlin, was also a student of Hegel there, became professor of philosophy in Bonn, and later at the University of Tübingen, where he spent the rest of his scientific career in his life as well. His major work was anthropology, anthropologie. I shortly show that as well. And also how he looked like. So this was already at a later time. Immanuel Hermann Fichte. And here, the title of this book, Anthropologie, Teaching of the Human Soul, founded on as natural scientific ways for natural researchers, soul doctors, psychiatrists, and scientifically educated people altogether. So the interesting thing about is the notion natural science, because what he tried to do is to gather all the evidence which was scientifically available, the physiological evidence, but also psychological evidence about what the human soul does, in order to gain a comprehensive picture of the human soul. His main focus was a psychological one, dealing, for example, with issues such as the different forms of consciousness, including phenomena such as clairvoyance, or near-death experiences, and in this context, of course, the question, is the human soul a reality, was then one of the main issues, understandably. So he tried to indirect evidence for his propositions, and one of his very important propositions was that the human soul works unconsciously in the human body, for example, in the processes of embryology, morphogenesis, and growth, previous to the awakening of the soul in its consciousness. So the soul works unconsciously in the body, and the soul does so with the same forces which afterwards become the forces of imagination and thinking. He calls that Leibbildende Fantasie, body-building imagination. leitbildende Fantasie. This we have, when a child can imagine later, it can only do so because the soul is freed partially from its activity, building up this, the body, and then becoming active in the human mind. Now, in the 20th century, there were no such interesting thoughts about the mind-body problem, except for Rudolf Steiner. It's very interesting how far these people already came in the beginning and the middle of the 19th century. And you see, 1876, that's the third edition of this book. This is in midst of the materialistic wave, you know, which rolls over everything. But there were these few eminent people who went a different way. One of the important questions, and that's the last thing I want to say about him, that interested him was, of course, the question, what happens to the soul after death? And he came to that because he dealt with the near-death experiences, which were already known at the time. They come up again today. We had excellent contributions 3 times to Robert, right? So this is a very important topic also today, and it was also at those days. And so, of course, the phenomena, the observable phenomena of the people, what they experience, etc., and also other considerations, led him to postulate that the soul continues to exist after death, that it is something, an entity, a reality in itself, which lives in the body, which forms the body, but afterwards has independent life from the body in the spiritual world. But Fichte, and that's very interesting now, he was aware of the fact that this is just an inference. We infer that this is the case. We cannot perceive. So he says, for example, we must admit that in the present state of our psychological knowledge, it is impossible in the way of direct observation to come even to an approximate certainty upon this question. So it is a hypothesis, certainty we could gain when we would perceive it. And therefore, psychology must develop into another direction. Psychology must take earnest the other half of the human soul life, as he puts it. One half is the human life ensouled in the body on earth, and the other half is the half that the soul lives in the spiritual world. And he says, up till now, scientific psychology has actually taken heed of only one half of the physical and mental processes of consciousness and shown some understanding of this. The other, equally important half, because it contains the basis of the former, the spiritual, the basis of the incarnated, I say it in my words, does not yet exist for this psychology. However, if the full spiritual being of man is to be recognized, this can only happen by paying equal attention to both halves and by understanding their true relationship to each other. This is the future task of psychology, which, it must be admitted, will obtain not merely significant new scope, but also a new, genuinely founded starting point for science, etc. he means. The fundamental understanding of the human being now raises the final results of anthropology to anthroposophy, because it is quite justified to speak of the knowledge which at first appears as something sensory and transient, so the physical, but justifies the character of inner eternity and transcendence, because if we can infer with a certain, well, justifiably can infer that the human soul goes on living, so it has eternity, and if it does really have an eternity, then we can call this wisdom, Sophia. Therefore, anthroposophia, anthroposophy, and not anthropology anymore. So we see that as Troxler does, he wants to develop anthropology as the physical, normal psychological knowledge about the human being to an anthroposophy, which has a perception of what happens in the spiritual world or on the spiritual side of our existence. And in Troxler, in the same way, Troxler talks more about the whole human being in the fourfoldness of body, physical body, life, soul, spirit. And Fichte is more interested in the soul, spirit itself, and also in the transcendental questions which have to do with life after death. So we see in a time when in mid-European universities and universities everywhere, materialism starts to become very, very strong, and all ideas of a transcendental or a really existing soul and spirit are abandoned. There are several people, and these are not the only ones, here in Central Europe, which want to develop anthropology to an anthroposophy, philosophy to an anthroposophy. This is very, very interesting to see. So we see that the work of Rudolf Steiner is not just, something exotic arising in the European culture, but it is prepared from Goethe. You see directly going the next steps already in years that Goethe lived, Anthroposophy is already there. And when Troxler dies, Rudolf Steiner is 5 years old. When Hermann Fichte dies in the year 1879, you know what that means? Rudolf Steiner starts his study with 18 years at the Technical University of Vienna. Right? So you have a transition. In order to now talk about Rudolf Steiner's position or contribution to the evolution of science, I would first like to mention a very interesting idea of Troxler about the evolution of consciousness and knowledge. He discerns mainly 3 major steps in this evolution. And this is really highly interesting. To depict it, this is my depiction. It doesn't make any drawing like this, but it could be symbolized like that. The human consciousness in the first stage of human evolution has what he calls an Urbewusstsein, a primeval consciousness. primeval,
Primeval, yes.
Primeval consciousness. This is a consciousness that is sometimes compared with the consciousness of wise children who, you know more than others, but they have like a dreamy state of consciousness. They cannot think yet, in a rational sense and so. And he says there, what later became separated in sensory perception and thinking is actually still a unity. It's not separated. It's a unified consciousness, and this he calls Urteilssein. Then comes a stage when this is lost. I may just align this is artificial. It's of course not, like steps like this, but it's a gradual transformation. But this will be the second phase where we have the consciousness where we really have only sensory perception on the one hand and concepts on the other. And that, he says, starts at a time which can characterize with Plato and Aristotle. Because Plato, still looking towards the spiritual world, which was perceived in old times, one had a spiritual perception, and Aristotle looking towards the physical world and founding the science of natural sciences which have to do with sensory perception and thinking. So that's for him is the mark, the general mark in the history. And then comes the modern times, but there will be a third development when a human being will ascend anew to be able to perceive the spiritual world, but in a new fashion. And what has been learned here as sensory perception and thinking, this will have to be taken on as a new faculty. So we do not go back, but we go on. And we reach something which was perceived here again, but with a new faculty. So this is a meaningful decadence, so to speak, into the material realm only, but there will be a new ascent. And for this, we have the training here in this time. And so this he calls anthroposophy, what will develop here. Actually, at one place he said this was also anthroposophy. This was like a primeval anthroposophy. Very interesting. If you think how Rudolf Steiner says how the primeval knowledge of the spiritual world comes in a new form in anthroposophy.
So
therefore,
atavistic then.
yes, what Rudolf Steiner calls atavistic. He doesn't use this word, but he says still that this is also example. Once he exclaims, so why should we go back to the wisdom of the old Chinese and Indians or the ancient wisdom altogether? Was the development since then for nothing, so that all the effort of newer science should be wiped out of the history of mankind? So you see, the question is not this, but this. And with this, I would like to come to Rudolf Steiner. Because it was Rudolf Steiner who, on the very basis of these efforts, sensory perception of thinking, lay the epistemological and methodological foundation for this new ascent, and to lead into a concrete realization of the anthroposophy, which had been called for by his predecessors, out of an inner necessity of Occidental science itself. That's the interesting thing about that. So Rudolf Steiner, you know, he lived from 1861 to 1925. Well, you know, his first development, he studied mathematics and natural sciences at the Technical University in Vienna. He also took philosophy courses at the University of Vienna. He dealt especially strongly at that time with Johann Gottlieb Fichte, the father of the other Fichte, and was at that time, when he started his studies, about to deal with epistemology of the time. Steiner later came to know the work of Troxler and Fichte, and he talked and wrote about them in several contexts, in full appreciation and agreement with their anthroposophies. But he took his point of departure for his own later work, the foundation, concrete elaboration, and justification of anthroposophy as a spiritual science, not from these thinkers, but, as you know, from his intensive study of natural sciences and mathematics. Geometry played a very important role. Goethe's natural scientific work, which Steiner edited in the two leading Goethe editions at the time. The philosophy of German idealism, namely Johann Gottlieb Fichte and Hegel. Contemporary epistemology with respect especially to Kantianism and Goethe. And one also has to say, on the basis of his own spontaneously arisen ability to experience spiritual reality, which, according to his self-biography, clearly appeared in his 8th year of age and could be brought into a more systematic form at the age of 19, with the guiding support of a man whose identity is not publicly known. And of course, then his own further self-schooling, etc. Now, how in Rudolf Steiner's work can this indicate the transition from natural science to spiritual science or anthroposophy be described? First, in his epistemology, Steiner makes clear that the concepts of our thinking activity, which our thinking activity is able to intuit and to add to the percepts in the act of cognition, reveal the lawfulness of these percepts. That means the lawfulness is experienced as a spiritual entity, albeit in an abstract form. But, as we also already talked about in the last lectures, only the appearance of the outer reality is sense perceptible. Its lawful essence proves to be spiritual. So, actually, Steiner's epistemology already shows that also the natural scientist has a spiritual approach to nature, in that he intuits the spiritual essence in the form of an idea or lawfulness in his own consciousness. And we saw that this becomes modern again today. Therefore, it is understandable that when Rudolf Steiner was a schoolboy and first encountered geometry, he was so happy to discover in geometry a spiritual element within ordinary consciousness and learning, which connected with what he experienced inwardly as a spiritual reality, but could not share with his surroundings, because this surrounding could not relate to a field of spiritual perception, because this perception was not accessible to his social surrounding, right? So there was an element, and I once had an experience myself when I taught at the University of Bern. And I talked about these very topics here that actually in our thinking we already have a spiritual element, and how this has, leads to a spiritual, albeit abstract, knowledge of the world. And then after the seminar, a student came up to me and said that this now really helped her very much, because, and then she revealed that she had very strong, very differentiated spiritual experiences, that she could not talk with people about that. A very healthy, modest, intelligent young person. It was clear there is no pathology in what she says. And this element, the spiritual element of human thought helped her, and that's what she said, to relate to make the relation between what she experiences spiritually and what she has to learn in natural science at medical school. So we see how important this element of thinking is, and to realize that this is already a spiritual element. That's one of the, let's say, results of Rudolf Steiner's epistemology. But here comes a problem, and this is the problem already Troxler detected, namely that these abstract thoughts of lawfulness are just ideas. They're abstract, and therefore we should learn to perceive the real spirit, the living spirit, and not just have ideas about nature, as natural science does. So, but we already saw also that, for example, in the notion of active information, as it, this was phrased by David Bohm and David Peat, we have already also today appearing the notion that there is active spirit working in nature. Right? So the question then would be how to learn to experience this activity, and not only the abstract thought content. Or to put it otherwise, one could say in this development here, actually, if people in earlier times used to experience the spiritual, or I would say, as I said, it was, as Troxler puts it, and that's not so far from what Rudolf Steiner says, that this was a unity, that one had meaningful spiritual experiences. Meaningful spiritual experiences. Meaning, the meaning remains. That's why this is supposed to depict the meaning, but the experiences got lost. So only the concepts of these, remained, and they became traditions. And so the meaning, actually the spirit that was left over was a dead, abstract spirit. We could therefore make this sign. We have learned about thinking, having straight lines. And this is to symbolize dead spirit. And it's very interesting that Hegel was very had a very interesting expression to symbolize what actually modern thinking, where modern thinking is. He talks about the Schädelstätte des Geistes, which means Schädelstätte is the location where the skulls are. It's the German word for Golgotha. Schädelstätte. Schädelstätte des Geistes. So what really happens is the death of the spirit. Okay. So life is lost. This is to symbolize here in color. Only dead spirit remains, therefore the symbol. But we know that apparently the spirit, and that's also, as we said, one can infer that of course nature, spirit is also in nature, only we don't experience it, right? And we have only the possibility to relate these dead thoughts to dead sensory perceptions. That's our knowledge that we have. But we know that actually in nature, spirit is active. So we have to think of what is behind this white surface. It's also color, right? So what? Color, it's forces. And now there's a very interesting thing, and that should lead us to see how Rudolf Steiner's work, the transition to a new perception of spirit can be made. When we are in a position to only have abstract perceptions or dead perceptions, in a way dead, they live more actually than our thoughts, but they're also not in that sense living, and these dead concepts. And one thing which is important to see is, we saw it on the first day when we tried to calculate prime number and could see that we had to exert an effort to, know that was the Fibonacci series, and had to see that we need an effort. We can then see that we do perceive, as we already said yesterday, we do perceive a spiritual activity, but not in the outside, but in the inside, in human consciousness. And that's the reason why I add here a small red line symbolizing that our thinking also has a force which earlier was not there. Earlier, when thinking started in the Greek time, the Greeks had more the impression they receive their thoughts. They don't produce them, they receive them. We still have this impression in all of those thoughts which are not abstract thoughts. For example, our remembrances. These are representations which come to our mind, even in cases when we don't want, right? We don't have to exert any effort for them to come, or very little. But with mathematics, we must. So this abstractness here allows us to become active. So in a sense, this death of the objective spirit is the condition for the human individuality to become active. We have to become active in order to produce them. And this is also the precondition for freedom. Just imagine that these concepts would not be, that the concepts we think would have an activity to them. So in your mind, you would experience forces. Well, this could maybe be very problematic. You know this from psychiatric pathologies. So the question is, could we withstand an activity of a thought content which has the activity in itself? Is it clear what I mean? Mm-hmm. And therefore, because the objective spirit within our consciousness has become dead, so to speak, like in a mineral way, it's mineralized spirit, so to speak. Therefore, the human mind has the ability or the chance to develop one's own force. And we have seen yesterday that this force is really that gives us also the security of our inner existence, and it makes us free, because when we act out of insight in ideas that we have freely chosen with our own spiritual activity, then we are free. Earlier periods were not free, and the consciousness was not free. Just look at how this super-sensible consciousness arose in ancient times. Just read in the Bible. These were, for example, like dreams, in a dream form. It was received at night in a similar way as we receive our dreams, but they mostly don't have such a spiritual, let's say, a connotation. They might have, but they mostly don't have. So that appears by itself. Or the Greeks, when they talk about the Erinians, so these Furies, yes, the Furies. So people were possessed by spiritual forces in a way. They were not free, and therefore also social life was not free. It was hierarchical, with the pharaoh on top, right? So freedom could only arise when the individual started to become free. Then also social freedom could arise. And this is a function of the time which started here, in this time, and which came about more and more, especially since, well, the Middle Ages and modern times. Then all these ideas of freedom came because of that reason. So the death of the spirit allows us our own life. And this now leads us to see what, for Rudolf Steiner, what relation this has to the path of meditation that Rudolf Steiner offers in the sense of anthroposophy to arrive at higher knowledge again. First of all, Rudolf Steiner makes clear, and this is something you can already learn through the philosophy of freedom, when you take it in such a way that you observe that in your own consciousness, what is said there. So it's like the music of a Beethoven sonata that you look at, but you play your own music. And Steiner said that actually one should study the philosophy of freedom in such a way that you use it as a partitur in order to develop your own music. A score, thank you. The score in order to develop your own music. And then you can perceive that your spiritual activity is already a spiritual perception. Steiner says that very clearly in the philosophy of freedom itself, especially in the editions of 1918, which are 100 years old now, and it's good to think about these 100 years and also these very important additions to the philosophy of freedom. But he also says this, for example, in his knowledge of the higher worlds, how it is achieved, where the spiritual path is described. He points to the importance of thinking for the development of spiritual capabilities. There he says, for the super-sensible activity here meant, it is exceptionally important to have a clear understanding of the experience of pure thinking such as in mathematics. This is put, or if you read Hegel's Logik, or all these kind of where you have to make an effort to think. That's pure thinking. Fundamentally speaking, this experience of pure thinking is already a supersensible activity of the soul, only it is one in which nothing supersensible is yet perceived. Nothing else. With pure thinking, one lives in the supersensible, but one experiences this alone in a supersensible way. One does not, as yet, experience anything else of a supersensible nature. And supersensible experience must be a continuation of that experience in the life of soul, which can be attained in union with pure thinking. In other words, and this is very important for this line of development, the supersensible activity, the ability to perceive in a supersensible way, is a continuation of that activity which we exert in abstract thinking. So, if we go to this willpower that we need in thinking, we can do eurythmy again, and you have learned that the will has to do with the circle, right? And so, you can exert willpower. You give willpower to those, let's say, dead thoughts, right? And this is also a way to see this symbol, which is important. The passage where Rudolf Steiner declares very clearly that this actually, the exertion of willpower in your consciousness, which has to take on the mode of thinking, of active thinking or active imagination. The point where he declares that as the principle of anthroposophic meditation is in the first chapter of Fundamentals of Therapy. There, Steiner and Dieter Wegmann say the following. Before making statements about the spiritual anthroposophy develops the methods which entitle it to make such statements. And then he says, you cannot, refine the sensory perception more and more. That doesn't lead you into the spirit. And also, you cannot make extrapolation in your thinking. That also does not lead you to the real spirit, but just to hypotheses of which nobody can show if they are true. And then he says, however, that immediately becomes different if one no longer stops short at the thinking which the human being initially acquires through life experience and education. And now come the important sentences. One can augment and strengthen this thinking in itself. Strengthening of thinking, right? This is strengthening thinking. Strength has to be, willpower has to be put in that. And how is that to be done? One can place simple, easily encompassed thoughts in the center of consciousness, and with exclusion of all other thoughts, concentrate all the force of soul on such ideas. You take an easily, this can be all kinds of things, a thought content or a picture, or it can also be a mantra, etc. And the important thing is to concentrate all the powers of your soul in a mode of, like, if you were thinking this, right? But now this is not discursive thinking, which follows the logic of the thought. This can also be done, and this is done in the first of the 6 side exercises. The discursive thinking, But this is concentrated thinking. That's why I made a symbol like this. It's an important concentration of all the power of the soul. And he says, as a muscle grows strong when exerted again and again in the direction of the same force, so the force of soul grows strong with respect to the region which usually governs thinking when it is exercised in the above mentioned way. It must be emphasized that these exercises have to be based on simple, easily encompassed thoughts. For in doing the exercises, the soul must not be exposed to any kind of influences that are semi-conscious or unconscious. We can but indicate the principle of such exercises here. A detailed description and instruction on how in particular such exercises should be done can be found in Rudolf Steiner's books Knowledge of the Higher Worlds, Occult Science, and Other Anthosophical Works. So, you see, that's the principle of meditation. And that's the opposite of letting go the thoughts and being just aware of other things like your breathing, your bodily position, or such things, or a gong, or such. It's active, willful concentration, all the powers of the soul. Now, what should happen through these exercises? What is the effect, according to Rudolf Steiner's description? In the course of such practice, an increase of the power of thought, the power of thought. Power is italicized, is attained, of which one had not the remotest idea before. The exercising of the power of thought is felt within oneself as a new content of one's being. And along with this new content of one's being, a world content is revealed which was not known by actual experience before, though one may perhaps have divined its existence. If one has taken the occasion in moments of introspection to observe everyday thinking, one finds the thoughts shadow-like, pale compared to the impressions given by the senses. What is now perceived in the strengthened force of thinking is not pale or shadow-like at all. It is full of inner content, vividly real and graphic, and it is indeed a reality far more intense than the content of sense impressions. A new world begins to dawn for the human being as he has thus expanded the strength of his faculty of perception. So the perception of thought, of the abstract thought, becomes a perception of the, let's say, living thought, of the living. Because what is meant by this new content of yourself? He means, and that's what he explains a little later, your etheric body. Because the forces with which one thinks are actually etheric forces, which are, let's say, through the will of the soul spirit, are used for thinking. And therefore, through activating thinking, the first thing to appear is let's say, the source out of which this thinking force derives. So that is the point. And he says a little later, it is of the utmost importance to know that the human being's ordinary forces of thinking are refined form and growth forces. A spiritual element reveals itself in the forming and growing of the human organism. And this spiritual element then appears during the course of later life as the spiritual power of thought. So, and to make it short, by perceiving the inner force, let's say organization, through this organization, also the external forces which are in the world are then or can then be perceived. So in an analogous way, as we through our physical body, we perceive the physical sensory world, through our etheric organization, we perceive the external etheric organization. So that's essentially the way which leads, according to Rudolf Steiner, to higher the faculty of perceiving the force with which lawfulness enacts itself in nature and in yourself. So that's the first stage of supersensible knowledge, called imagination. And it acts also with the imaginative force. Just think of what Fichte said at this point. It's very interesting how close these people came then to what is really there, also from the standpoint of Rudolf Steiner. So this was just said in principle, but it's important to see that Steiner explicitly says here, this is the principle of how such exercises have to be made. And if you look at the different kinds of meditational content that Rudolf Steiner gave, which is extremely different, you know, it can be plants in nature, for the doctors, for example. It can be Hegel's logic. It can be, well, mantras, you know, class lectures. It can be symbolic pictures, for example, as the rose cross, which has to be built up in such a way that you don't only have inner representation of that, but that you also develop feelings, and then that you concentrate on this inner representation combined with feelings that you have to develop before. You know that from occult science, or that's the place where this is very carefully described. So, so far, the attainment of the faculty to come back to this, but in a new sense, in that the activity which actually starts here around Plato and Aristotle is taken up again. And from this point of view, one could say that what Rudolf Steiner does is actually a continuation of what Aristotle did, but in the opposite direction. Because it was Aristotle who induced the scientific principle of perception and thinking, right? Logic. Rudolf Steiner takes this up, uses the same basic element of cognition, of science, and this is an important point that I would like to make, that to perceive, the spiritual perceive is not spiritual science yet. Spiritual science is only science when it understands the perception that one has. Therefore, as Steiner states, also in his latest edition of Theory of Goethe's World Conception, that also anthroposophy, spiritual science, uses the same principles of cognition, having perceptions on the one hand and concepts on the other, in order to generate science. So that's also the reason why Steiner says it's not sufficient just to develop a higher faculty of higher perception, but you also have to develop your faculty to judge what you see. And but as Steiner also has, carries on this principle of science, perception and thinking, And he takes the element that has been developed in humanity since, how we're thinking. Now, with the aim to lead into the third phase of human development, whereas Aristotle led into the second. So Rudolf Steiner, in this way, really continues, one could say, the work of Aristotle. And for this reason, if you think of these principles of cognition and the principle how to develop this higher perception out of your own will activity, this element in the dead, let's say, in the dead concept system, but to be able to then perceive powers, spiritual powers, then you can see that this must be of a very long, let's say, a relevance also for hundreds and also probably thousands of years. Just as Aristotle was the beginner of a new phase, and that is the second phase, so Rudolf Steiner introduces humanity to a new phase. And I would say in this sense, one can see that Rudolf Steiner's contribution to the evolution is a gigantic one. One doesn't realize this today maybe so much because one is very close, but if you think about the role Aristotle played in the history of mankind, human cognition and science, then you can see that here actually happens a very similar thing. I would like to add a word about the relation of anthroposophy as a spiritual science to natural science, the natural sciences, especially in the way they are performed today. Because of course, if one, as Rudolf Steiner, has studied mathematics and natural sciences, and you know how highly Steiner esteems natural sciences, then it is clear that his aim is not only to develop only in quotation marks, is not only to develop the spiritual science, but also to make the spiritual science fruitful for natural sciences. That's a very important point. Because the question is also, how do these anthroposophical ideas, for example, about the human being, about the four elements in the human organization, physical body, etheric body, meaning life, astral body, meaning the soul, and the human spiritual self, how does that, how does that function in the organs, in health and disease, etc.? How are therapists thought to work? If you take all this, what Rudolf Steiner expressed in his lectures for doctors, then, of course, if one reads that as a modern scientist and has no clue of Rudolf Steiner's, let's say, scientific foundation of what he says, one might think, well, that's very strange. It looks very strange. He uses vocabularies that people don't understand, and he talks very aphoristically, usually very aphoristically, and so he makes a sketch and so, but it is very interesting, especially in the medical lectures, you can see that how he thinks that these anthroposophical thoughts, which are, let's say, the result of a spiritual cognition, which is able to find the concepts, the lawfulness for what has been experienced spiritually, that these concepts then, which also have to be expressed in a thinkable thought, right? How they should be related to modern science in medicine, for example. And I would like to read you just two short things to see what Steiner's own opinion was in that respect. Because one can imagine that it is sometimes difficult. As I said, if people read that, they think, well, that's a bit queer. So how can you use that when you don't have a known spiritual knowledge, perception? How should you use it? Are anthroposophists believers, right? Is that the belief? Just what Steiner says? And when you yourself are not able yet, maybe, or to just a micro extent to have spiritual perceptions in the sense of Rudolf Steiner, what do you do with that? Or if you are a critical scientist who does not believe that such a higher faculty of cognition might be possible, what should you do with that in order to remain within the confines of modern medical, experimental, and clinical science? I won't make any much longer. That's just these short. Here. Now, in lectures on academic science, or the relation of anthroposophy to academic science, Steiner says, it looks like this. Natural science applies on one side, spiritual science, spiritual research on the other side. Just as when you dig a tunnel and when everything has been calculated properly, tunneling from two sides, you meet in the middle. So spiritual research and natural scientific research meet and produce the whole of knowledge which people seek. Now, more specifically, in his medical lecture, he says, use what I say was what I tell you aphoristically, use this as what he calls leading thoughts, or sometimes hypotheses, and today we would say hypothesis, and test that with your experimental, empirical methods you have in modern medicine and science. For example, I wanted to tell you this as a principle in order to make you understand these things, that these things depend upon a rationale. As a rationale, he means the spiritual scientific rationale expressed in thoughts also. You will find, but the rationale is merely a regulating principle, or hypothesis we would say today. You will find that the statements based on this principle can be verified, as all such facts are verified by the methods of modern medicine. There is no question of asking you to accept these things before they have been tested, but it is really true that anyone who enters into them can make remarkable discoveries. He also meant, that by working these things out, taking them as hypotheses, working out in science, you will find new things. It's too long now to talk about that, but this has also been done in several fields. Indeed, all that comes from anthroposophical investigation in regard to medicine, and for instance physiology, can be nothing more than a stimulus which must be then worked out empirically. Only on the basis of this empirical study can there arise valid and convincing judgments of the matters in question. And this is the kind of judgment that is needed in the domain of therapy. So this is, today would say, what is this today? How would we call that? Where are the doctors here?
Some kind of evidence-based.
Evidence-based medicine, based on empirical evidence. Full stop. That's what Steiner really wanted to have. So, and I'm glad Branko Fürst is here, because his book, in Springer Press, is one example, an excellent example how this can be done. You take these fragmentary, because actually it's not systematic teaching of Steiner, but certain aphoristically expressed thoughts about the functioning of heart and circulation. Take all the evidence you get from embryology, physiology, pathology, and you arrive at Branko First's book, showing that Rudolf Steiner's heart physiology thoughts are verifiable. So that's therefore, I think this is a super example to show this. What I would like to come to a close. My main aim was to show you that the contribution of Rudolf Steiner to the evolution of science is really the carrying forward of the natural scientific impulse into the realm of the spiritual, and that the spirituality as such, as perception, can be acquired through enhancing those forces which have been developed since Aristotle in human. So this is a continuation of our, let's say, the forces which first originated in the Occident, but of course they are not Occidental forces. They are all, let's say, human forces that are globally existent. And this, of course, then leads also to an understanding of what the earlier cultures have been thought. So we do really not need to go backwards in this sense, but to go forwards. This I wanted to point out today about the relevance of Rudolf Steiner's work for the evolution of science. Thank you for your attention.